Our next presentation is going to be a forest carbon update from Andy Whitman. Andy has been a forest climate carbon analysis for the Maine Forest Service since 2023. Andy has worked in the managed forests of Maine and New England for 3 decades as a field researcher, analyst, and applied scientist, developing practical guidance. This has included working with stakeholders of many backgrounds and perspectives, from industry to academia to government and conservation groups. His cross-cutting work has addressed forest policy, economics, sustainability, certification, biodiversity, and ecosystem services and climate sciences. Before working for the Maine Forest Service, Andy worked for Manomet, a conservation science nonprofit, and holds a Master of Science degree in wildlife ecology from UMaine. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here this morning. I hope I can give a talk that's informative. And I'm going to talk a little bit about forest carbon offsets, just the concept. I think most people probably have a fairly good idea, but I want to make sure people are clear on that. And then I'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the global factors, and then national factors, and then something about what's going on in Maine. So to help put that all in perspective. But I really want to start with this perspective, which is it's helpful following Eric Kingsley, of forest carbon offsets are really just a small sliver of this notion of sort of the bioeconomy. There's these other elements that are playing that have to do with carbon and greenhouse gases. There's carbon neutral products. Irving did a full life cycle assessment of some of their products in order to understand whether or not they were neutral, and they were, and use that as an advertising or a consumer, you could either call attribute or gimmick. Eric Kingsley talked very eloquently, as he always does, about sort of the large number of emerging new products that are coming to bear and getting tested in Maine on the operational end. And then finally, the whole situation with sort of timberland investment is evolving. And part of that is, began long before the present in terms of conservation easements and the role that has in the investment picture for landowners. There is this emerging interest in biodiversity credits. No, I just won't say much about that. And then finally, carbon offsets, which is what I will talk about. And I should just preface everything from, so as an analyst, I really get, and something of a data nerd, I really get into information and data. And nothing I say today should be construed as being sort of the viewpoint of the Maine Forest Service, or representative of policy initiatives or its intentions. My effort is really just to help better inform you folks, so that you have a better idea of what are forest carbon offsets, what do they possibly mean for Maine, what's the opportunity limitation, potentially some greater awareness of difficulties or barriers that in terms of how they might impact our economy. So just trying to open up that conversation a little bit, so that you're better informed and can be more thoughtful. All of you have your own sources of information and perspectives that are useful and informative. I've enjoyed talking to a lot of people in this audience over time, and being informed richly by your experiences. I mean, overall, I would say this is, whenever you involve markets, it gets very complex very quickly. And by no means do I think I have any edge on understanding the markets thoroughly. So I want to just talk briefly about sort of carbon offset credits and just the notions and specific to Maine. And I'm here in this context, I'm sort of talking about what are the opportunities for carbon credits or carbon offset credits with respect to the Maine forest. And I think it's worth sort of mentioning the emissions reduction opportunity and how, principally in Maine, the biggest or most interesting opportunity is thinking in terms of either biofuels or biochar. And there are protocols where biochar and carbon credits associated with that are possible and probably are an important part of the financial aspects of making biochar production work in Maine. But I'm not going to talk about that, but I do want to mention that. And what I will talk about is sort of credits that are associated with carbon dioxide removal. Trees are the oldest and the ultimate carbon removal or carbon dioxide removal technology. And to this point, I would say unmatched in terms of the efficiency and the cost that they do that. And then sort of emissions avoidance, which is just making, essentially, in simple iteration, keeping forest as forest. And in some cases, people are thinking in terms of keeping older forest as older forest and the carbon stores that they have. So forest carbon offsets are really, in one level, really a pretty simple thing. In this graphic, you'll see you have this manufacturing plant on the left that has emissions. On the right, you have this forest that's owned by another individual. And what they do is they come to an agreement through a very elaborate process, but an agreement of the forest landowner will change some aspect of their management so that they are sequestering more carbon. And in this case, the manufacturing facility will actually pay that landowner for that. The result of which is the buyer of those carbon credits then can deduct that from their gross greenhouse gas emissions and make claims about how much they're emitting. And the forest landowner then has to, if they want to make claims about greenhouse gas emissions or reduction or sequestration, they have to sort of reduce their claims. You can think of it really as, you're buying it's an accounting process, really. And instead of money moving around, it's the notion of carbon moving around. And this, I hope, gives a sort of more visual example of that. So on this side, you have the profile of this company and its emissions. It's a tiny company. It's got, I just made this is quasi-real in terms of some of the stats I pulled out of the literature, but this is not actually a real example of anything. So you have a small company, 23 employees. On average, a company like this emits 6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, resulting in 138 tons of carbon dioxide emitted each year, this much. Over here you have this forest landowner, and they're sequestering about this much carbon, about 250 tons a year. It's called negative because it's pulling it out of the air. This is considered positive because it's putting it up in the air. And so they sell this much in carbon credits to this company and reduces their emissions by this much. And in the meantime, in terms of what this landowner could claim, that reduces what they could claim in terms of carbon sequestered. So that's basically simply how it works. You can better see, I hope, through this example of how it's bookkeeping. And that's one of the odd things about carbon credits, and as we think and talk about them, because we all know we're not actually physically moving carbon around. They're an intangible instrument. And that always adds a little bit to the confusion. So, what's the process in which this happens? So I've got 2 charts I want to just run through really quickly. So first of all, there's this process of a landowner going through a project of design. Typically, very large landowners might develop the project themselves, spec out where the carbon's coming from, follow a rigorous protocol from a registry. Sometimes landowners will farm that out to a project developer. They'll develop the project, they'll register the project, and then you go through a verification phase where a third party comes in and actually verifies that they are in fact sequestering that much carbon, and that actually, other facets are addressed, like, they actually change practices. And then the registry will register those credits and issue those credits. And then a transaction can occur and those credits are sold. And for mysterious reasons that probably Eric knows, but I don't, they refer to that as retiring credits. And once the credits are retired, you can't resell those credits. The registries make that visible and transparent so that everybody knows, Joe sold 100 carbon credits if Joe comes to you next week and wants to sell you 100 carbon credits, you go to the registry and say, wait a minute, Joe, you've already sold those credits. These aren't real credits. And so these registries sort of help keep everybody honest and make everything transparent. This is sort of another schematic to sort of look at how sort of the flow of information and sort of the entities that get involved with this whole process. So you have a landowner, they change their harvest practices. You've got a project developer who works with the landowner to develop the project, get the project registered, eventually also works then to have those credits sold by working with different kinds of brokers. But before you can actually issue those credits, you have the third-party verification that happens. They report to the landowner and to the carbon registry, and then those credits become available. And you can see they go under contract with the developer. The developer actually is the one who sells the credits, and money flows back to the landowner. So that's, it's a pretty complicated process. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of global markets because, one of the things is we have a new administration, and this week basically issued a presidential directive to avoid all state level efforts, policies with respect to climate. And in other ways, it's just sort of not favorable to responses to climate change. And I don't want to get into politics, but it's helpful to understand not just what's the U.S. picture, but what's the global picture. So this gives you an idea of just how much activity is going on in terms of carbon pricing, including carbon credits. And you can see, almost 25% of the global economy and its emissions are in some kind of carbon pricing scheme, which is a short way of saying is I don't think this stuff's going away. And this gives you sort of a global picture of so where's the carbon pricing going on? And it's not just a North American phenomena, it's not just a European phenomena. Despite all our skepticism about China doing anything about their greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, they're actually doing some things, and it's a huge market. But there's activities in other parts of the world as well. And the other question people often have is, so who's buying these credits? Perhaps you have recently flown, and you can see a lot of airlines have this option of you click the box and you can offset your credits, or if you've had to rent a car, you can, if you're interested, you can sort of offset your emissions. That's really relatively small, really tiny parts of the market. You can't see very well in this graphic, but basically if you drop down to, okay, we're talking about improved forest management credits, and the big player is actually Microsoft. A large amount of the credits are being bought by Microsoft, which, generally I think of when you have one major buyer, it makes me kind of nervous in terms of, well, if they, change direction, that has a huge impact on the market. But there are some other major players. I mean, JP Morgan is a major player, Shell Oil Company, Chevron Oil Company, Target. But I do watch what's going on with Microsoft, because if they decide to bail on improved forest management carbon markets, that would probably have an impact. But my sense is they're very committed in terms of their own greenhouse gas emissions, and they seem pretty committed on improved forest management. So a little bit about the national picture, and I get a lot of questions about, like, you hear about all these different entities doing different things, and it's kind of confusing of what role are different entities playing in this. And I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about that, because there's a lot of different players doing different things, and I sort of divide that into two groups, one of which is who's working to sort of expand forest car offset markets, and so this is sort of working on the demand side, and then who's working to increase enrollment in natural climate solutions, including forest carbon offsets. I look at that as sort of the supply end. So you have publicly traded companies that are buying forest carbon offset credits. You have countries who are interested, and part of it is with the previous administration, and other countries are looking at understanding that rural economies are struggling and rural landowners have certain kinds of financial difficulties or economic difficulties. So trying to figure out, is there some way to use climate as a way of redirecting funds and part of the economy back into those rural communities. You have NGOs, environmental nonprofit organizations, oriented land conservation, and are looking at forest carbon offset credits as a way to help fund their land conservation efforts. You have farm and forest land investors who are looking to increase the profitability of their land, looking for new revenue streams. And then finally, you have philanthropy who's very interested in funding the climate transition and looking for market instruments to do that instead of them funding it on their own. In terms of the supply, you have the so-called global south countries, principally Asia, Africa, and South America, who are interested in funding to support the climate transition, both on renewable energy but other aspects. In the United States and some other countries, you have rural landowners who are seeking additional revenue streams given the situation in commodity markets, both in food and in wood. So they're looking to increase land values, or they're facing increasing land values, but really either flat or highly volatile commodity pricing. So this additional revenue stream is important for them. And you have pro-forest groups. I didn't say pro-forestation, I said pro-forest. Among other things, looking at forest carbon offsets as a way to meet their 30 by 30 goals. And including a lot of conservation organizations active in the Northeast. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the spatial distribution of offset projects, just to give perspective, because it's actually kind of hard to understand. Like, we hear some things in Maine. What's going on in the United States overall? So I mean, this graph basically portrays sort of the number of projects per state. And you see California has a large number of projects. They have their own cap and trade program that includes improved forest management carbon credits. And so that helps explain the California situation. But then you can see some other regional forest economies or areas where the forest economy is really important, Northeast, Southeast, and Pacific Northwest, where you actually see a lot of activity in terms of number of projects. If you look at actually the sale of credits in these different states, similar kind of picture. California really sticks out. Interesting enough, Alaska really sticks out. A lot of Native American corporations have gotten involved in forest carbon offset credits. And then you see West Virginia sticks out. And Maine has, more than the average state, but doesn't stick out that much. This gives you an idea of where Maine is in terms of number of credits. So right here, it's the fifth state in terms of total number of credits that are registered. And then I think it's informative to look at the spatial distribution of the credit concentration or density. And this is simply total number of credits in the state divided by the amount of forest land in the state. And you can see California pops out again. West Virginia really pops. And that's been a source of great controversy in West Virginia. You can sort of think of it as not a precise measure, but something of a measure of how much of land is encumbered in carbon, and therefore some amount of that wood is not available for other kinds of wood products. Maine's a little higher than the average U.S. state, but not so much. And this gives you an idea again where Maine falls, though. Again, we're number 5 in terms of carbon credit concentration. It's a little different. This is a informative statistic, but not a very precise one, because what it doesn't take into account is the length of the carbon credit contract. So you can imagine if you have high credit density, but they're only for 5 years, it's not so much of a big deal. If you have high credit density, where a lot of your wood is in carbon projects for 100 years, that becomes a problem. And the difficulty is you have projects that are 40 and 100 years. But this gives you a rough idea of sort of where Maine stands. And so what's driving this? So here's a fun map to look at. The thing I'll call your attention to is the orange, which are large institutional investors. And you can see, no surprise, Maine is very orange. Down in Louisiana and Texas, you have a lot of orange. No surprise in the southeast, kind of scattered orange in terms of that ownership. West Virginia pops out, very concentrated. And then when you go to the Pacific Northwest, west of the Cascades. And so I think this is one of many factors. Basically, you have carbon at scale and concentrated that makes it easy to administer from a contractual basis. So, but it's really complex. There's not a simple like why do you go to West Virginia? Why do you go to these other states? Each state, in terms of the density of carbon projects, varies and has its own story. But I would say some of the factors are probably large parcels, currently low ROI because of topographic relief, maybe growth and yield, other factors. Landowner objectives, the presence of large conservation or land conservation groups, and then finally the condition of wood markets. And I don't think any one of these factors is decisive. I think they're all potentially influential, but even at the state level in different states, they have different kinds of influence. So it's not it's a complex situation. A lot of people kind of bristle when conservation organizations do carbon offset credits. So I produced this, really simple chart of sort of who's selling carbon credits. And here's the list of the top 15 states. And you can see most of these states, 86% of these states, it's really large commercial landowners that are selling carbon credits, followed by about half of them, it's large land conservation organizations, and then finally tribal nations. So this is just looking at carbon credit issuance over time and what the time trend is. Going back to 2002, and it's fairly low, and then around 2013 it starts to climb, peaks up here, then kind of falls, and in 2023 it's much lower. And there's some signs it's coming back up, but that's to be determined. I'll just talk briefly on pricing and, to give, again, sort of context of improved forest management carbon credits and how do they fall compared to other kinds of, you've heard probably about other kinds of carbon credits. And along this bottom line, you can see different kinds of project types, sustainable ag and soil carbon, improved forest management, wetland or peatland restoration, afforestation, and reforestation, cook stoves of all things. That's an interesting area of activity. There's conservation in terms of largely preservation of rainforests or tropical forests, and then industrial efficiency. And you can see improved, these green dots are sort of averages. This is from, I believe, 2023. And you can see in terms of average, improved forest management scores pretty high. But it's only about, averaging about around 30 bucks a CO2 equivalent ton or credit. And a huge range, huge variance. In fact, the largest variance of any of these. And that large variance just speaks to the quality of the credits. There's a lot of factors that go into quality, but the quality of the carbon project really has an influence on price. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of what's going on in Maine, scaling back down into where we are. So first thing I want to start out with is sort of a trend of improved forest management, carbon credit issuances for the state going back, starting in 2022, going to 2023. And you can see we had some spikes. One spike was simply because the Passamaquoddy tribe sold a ton of credits, and then you can see a second spike where the Nature Conservancy and Baskegan both had issued a lot of credits. I'm sorry, didn't sell, but issued. And then it sort of comes down, and it's been kind of a little quiet actually in 2024, but I think there's a lot of conversations going on. So it certainly has not gone away for Maine. So in Maine, you have a lot of different types of landowners that are involved with carbon credit projects, and then different scales of projects. So basically, almost every kind of forest landowner in the state has gotten involved with forest carbon offset credits to varying degrees. Even we now have these small programs aimed at family woodland owners, not many acres for the most part. But land trusts, large commercial landowners. We have not had, I'm pretty sure we have not had actually government entities get involved, certainly not the state, and then tribal nations, principally the Passamaquoddy. And then you have sort of, you can sort of bin projects by the landowner size. So we have these small programs I'll talk a little bit more about, but they're really geared to sort of actually about 30 acres to 1,000 acres. And that has an increase in interest. I get a lot of inquiries from small landowners about those programs. You have a lot of conservation projects that have really come in more in the 1,000 to 10,000 acre range in terms of size and scale. And typically, those programs are a fair amount of land is aimed at sort of no harvesting at all through the life of the contract. Some of that land, I think, is destined for permanent preserves. A fair amount of that land probably is not. And then you have, anything above 5,000 acres. And typically, I think of those projects as sort of being deferred commercial harvest. So it's not that harvesting stops. It's just that they are going to lengthen out their rotation, and it may not be very long. It may be only an extra 10 years. For some wood markets, 10 years can be a long time, but in terms of the whole global, the whole Maine wood market, perhaps not. So, and just to reiterate in terms of the kinds of projects we see in Maine, so again, there's these potential for biochar projects with these biochar plants. We have removal credits that really focus on improved forest management with family forest land projects and large landowners, both conservation and commercial. Those will entail some kind of forest management, not as much wood though, and then sort of outright avoidance, which is really just locking up land, but really a small proportion of the acres. I mentioned something about these family forest programs because you may have neighbors who ask you about this. And currently there's sort of 4 programs in the state. They work with landowners from as little as 30 acres to upwards of 5,000 acres. They do all the heavy work, so the landowner basically just has to sign a contract. It's very challenging to support landowners because every landowner has their own financial planning and story. And so how to inform them but not advise them can be somewhat challenging. So one of the things, one of the obvious questions asked with forest carbon offset projects is how do they affect local wood markets? You probably all are aware of what's going on in northern New Hampshire and the concerns of the impact to the wood economy there. And I just put this up in terms of it's not, what I appreciate is a bit of this is, in terms of the impacts, is location, location, location. If you're put a big project right next to a mill, that may be problematic. You know, in a location like this, it might not. And we really don't know. But certainly everybody gets nervous about projects closer to mills and projects farther, compared to projects farther away from mills. So this map basically sort of maps out the distribution of projects in the state of Maine as of 2023. The blue are land conservation organization projects. The green is the Passamaquoddy, and then the mustard are sort of private projects. The size of the dot indicates the scale in terms of number of credits involved. And so a fair number of projects are really in this area where we've had some mill losses. And so they may or may not be as problematic as they might be in other locations. My limited interaction with procurement foresters suggests that they're concerned, but have not really seen an impact. But we also don't have a really strong wood market right now. But you can see, you know, some of these projects are relatively tiny. You know, these are like 1,000-acre projects. That's a TNC project. The blue one up here is TNC. This is AMC, and the Trust for Northeast Forest Trust, Passamaquoddy, and then a smattering of different commercial landowners. So overall, in terms of trend, right now we're about 8% of Maine forest land is encumbered by forest carbon projects. I don't think it's a desperate situation, but it definitely gets you, kind of perks up your ears of like what's going on with carbon and what does that mean for our wood markets. And just sort of some other opportunities. You know, why Maine? I think because of there's lower trade-offs for timber revenue in Maine. We have a lot of different large landowners, even land conservation organizations that are in commercial timber. And then for smaller landowners, Maine has more landowners enrolled in current use valuation programs, tree growth, than other states. So they're used to being enrolled in something and having to figure out some of that. And with that, I'll end. And I don't know if we have time for a question or two. Right. Well, as a Maine Forest Service employee, I don't promote it, but I always encourage landowners and their foresters to consider the different options in terms of revenue and how does that match their expectations and needs, both and their objectives. And so the first thing I do is I direct, you know, landowners to understand your objectives. You can talk to a district forest of the Maine Forest Service or their forester. Because it's really important. I mean, some landowners are, you know, to a certain extent, you know, when they have cash flow emergencies, they're dependent on that land, and perhaps a carbon program is not good for them. But for landowners who, you know, are more in the long haul, it potentially is an opportunity. Or if their land's heavily cut over, it's potentially an opportunity. But there's this encumbrance. You know, you have to be in the shortest family program is 20 years. You know, the financial situation for some landowners, I don't think that's a good option. I'm not going to tell them they shouldn't. I'm just, but for other landowners, it's a great option. Every situation I've talked to a landowner, a small landowner, what I've been surprised at is every time I think I've figured this out in terms of how this works for different landowners, I find a new angle of I never would have thought this is either a great opportunity or the opposite, where I would have said, if I didn't talk to the landowner, I would have said their land was perfect for this. And then I talked to the landowner and realized my personal opinion, not what I tell them, but my personal opinion is I'm not sure this is a good option for them. So it's complex. And I think the more foresters are involved working with landowners on this to help them figure out, you know, their financial goals and their other goals for their land, you know, then I think it can work well. There are no programs that are like that. There was one, NCX, which was actually year by year and was very popular with some landowners in Maine for that very reason. Tremendous amount of flexibility. And they were not able to successfully register their protocol with one of the registries, which was a key step in terms of validating their approach. And so that disappeared pretty quickly when they were not able to do that. One of the programs has heavy payments in the first couple of years, and then they're light payments until the very end, and then a significant payment at the end. I think 10 to 20%, but it's pretty well spread out. Others just spread it out continually across the years. I have, I've heard people have bare conversations about that concept, but I've not seen. What I didn't talk much about is the notion that there's voluntary and mandatory markets. So California has a mandatory market. When they first started, actually, we had projects in Maine for that market. Even though they were offsetting companies in California, the activity was in Maine. Those projects have continued, but they're not enrolling any new projects outside of, I believe if you're in California, you want to do improved forest management, the project has to be in California, Oregon, Washington State, or British Columbia. So verging on that, but not exactly that. And it was interesting, the most recent greenhouse gas inventory for Maine actually did some analysis to see what's the impact of credits. If you assume all the credits in Maine went somewhere else, how does that affect the greenhouse gas inventory for Maine?
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.